This is going to be our keynote speaker. His name is Dr. Andrew McKillop, who is a senior lecturer in Scottish history at the University of Glasgow. Mackie, as he's called. His new book is titled Human Capital and Empire, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and the British imperialism in Asia, 1690 to 1820. And this is going to be published later this year by the Manchester University Press. Before I switch over to Mackie, I just wanted to remind you what Eloise said a bit earlier about the chat room function and how that works, and after Mackie's finished speaking, how you will be able to pose your questions. So you can put them in the chat. A good indicator of whether you're asking a question or posing a comment is just to put you can put a letter Q, or you can write question and then ask your question, and then it's up to you whether you would like to pose it yourself, or I'll read out the question for at the end. And again, just a reminder to keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute. Thank you, Mackie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see and hear me effectively. My internet has just suddenly decided to start playing up a bit, so hopefully we will stay connected. Before I begin, let me just first of all thank Daisha, Eloise and Matthew for inviting me to speak to what I think, as Neil said, is an actually very timely conference in lots of different ways. I was once formerly off the University of Aberdeen, and it's great to be back, albeit virtually, and to see so many well-known colleagues. What I'm going to do today is just broadly, I think, provide what I hope will be a useful contextualizing exercise, which will open up some space and perspectives for the excellent sequence of papers which we'll have over the next couple of days. I'm now going to share my screen. I am in the hands of Teams technology, which is going to be interesting. Bear with me while I see if I can bring up a PowerPoint. Can I get some indication that everyone can see that? Can everyone see that? Daisha, do you want to just confirm if everyone can see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, great. Thank you. Excellent. Good stuff. Well, let me begin then. I've put up two images, which in a sense, I suppose, typifies hopefully the whole theme of the conference. The one image from the eastern half of the empire, namely John Forbes of Strathdon's shipping and company offices in Bombay from 1810, and the mansion of the Gordons of Gesbuck in central Aberdeenshire, who are of course a major planting family and typical, in fact, of many of the northeast of Scotland's regional gentry and their immersion in the Atlantic economic system of enslavement, which formed such a key part of the Atlantic Empire. But let me turn to the question of regional perspectives on what was very much in the period the conference is dealing with a global empire. When the organisers first asked me to give a paper on the theme of the northeast of Scotland's connections to early modern British colonialism, my immediate reaction was threefold. On the one hand, I thought, great, good topic, it's long overdue. After all, as Neil Curtis indicated in his opening remarks, there's no denying that in the context of the upturn of scholarship on Scotland and the British Empire, there's been either intentional or more likely unintentional neglect of the Northeast and its role in it. Yet, at the same time as I thought that, I couldn't help wondering, are there in fact very good reasons why the Northeast is underexplored? It can appear, arguably, to lack the obvious societal changing empire connections of the sort experienced by, say, the Clyde Basin between about 1680 and 1840, or for that matter, if we take a different part of Scotland, the onset of mass emigration to the colonies of settlement in North America, as experienced by the region after about 1730. It is precisely the intensity of the immersion in empire by these parts of Scotland which explain why the country is now such a significant example of the transformative power of early modern empire upon metropolitan as much as upon colonial society. But as we can see, the range of papers for this conference demonstrates quite clearly that the northeast of empire was unquestionably engaging with empire, a point which will make the third element of my reaction seem positively perverse. Now, what I mean by this is when I sort of dwelt on the request by the organisers to talk about the northeast, I sort of ended up with in a sense, a more substantive question still, and that was, what exactly do we gain by adopting a northeast of Scotland lens on the theme of colonialism beyond enriching local understandings of that part of Scotland? Now, questioning the entire premise of the conference might seem an unduly negative way to start things, and it's probably by now got the organisers wondering why on earth they asked me to kick things off, but bear with me for a second. The so what question is not a matter of excessive defensiveness. It's rather more about pondering the benefits and, let's be clear, the possible limitations of a regional perspective. In an age when our histories are becoming ever more transnational and global, and when analysis of Britain's empire is rightly focusing on giving voice to the silenced, to the marginalised and the brutalised, does centering the northeast risk cutting across and undermining those trends? That question certainly came to my mind when I thought on Antoinette Burton's sceptical assessment in 1997 of the value of Irish, Scottish and Welsh, never mind regional, perspectives on British colonialism. For Burton, such framing threatened to detract from what was then the new imperial history's priority of better understanding the cultural underpinnings of imperialism, and how these created gendered and racialised worldviews that removed the voice and the dignity of millions of subject peoples, while idealising and buttressing concepts of British and indeed for that matter wider white and European exceptionalism and superiority. Set against the objective of recovering the role of race, gender and other associated systems of colonial power, Burton argued, an emphasis on Scottish, Welsh or Irish participation in empire was simply reprivileging the imperial centre. In other words, it risked what she called, quote, metropolitan parochialism, end quote. Now, Burton's analysis, I would argue, is indicative of the new imperial history's own blind spots when it comes to defining what it means by inclusive and diverse historical approaches. But nonetheless, I think the point is an important one, and I think it's one the conference should bear in mind during its deliberations. Yet, any tension between a focus on Scotland's local diversity and decentering the wider frameworks of metropole, colony and associated economies, societies and cultures isn't as great as it might first appear, it seems to me. Just as global history has revivified familial and micro-histories, so the worldwide character of British colonialism requires us to be flexible and realistic with our scales of analysis. Regional perspectives can help to avoid a range of pitfalls, it seems to me, some of which include but aren't limited to exceptionalising Scotland's place within British imperialism, and that exceptionalising based possibly upon atypical developments, the rise of Glasgow, for example, or the tendency to generalise from anecdotal examples or the trajectory of prominent individuals, be they planters, generals, abolitionists, missionaries, etc. As an investigative perspective, region, it seems to me, helps us complicate the coloniser in more nuanced and sophisticated ways. Now, having swung from questioning regional perspectives to defending them, I think it's also important that the conference and us all think seriously about what we mean by the northeast of Scotland. Now, I'm sure each paper is going to have its own definition in this respect. I have to admit my own is entirely and characteristically unimaginative, and it's based upon administrative units. Namely, I defined, at least in the recent book, the northeast as meaning the counties of Angus, Kincardine, Aberdeen and Banff. You might make a case for saying that parts of Murray ought to be involved, or indeed that definition could be restricted. But it is worth pointing out under the definitional theme that there are other ways of looking at how we might define the Northeast beyond administration. Take, for example, Charles Fithian Adams's fantastic idea, which he applied in England to describe what he called that country's cultural provinces. Fithian Adams uses natural watersheds, riverine systems, and economic alignments to define what he meant by a cultural province. Now, it's worth pointing out that this idea has never been adapted for Scotland, a sign, I would suggest, of how beyond fairly well-known ideas of lowland and highland, Scottish historical studies lags significantly behind other parts of the UK and Ireland, for that matter, in conceptualising the country's internal configurations. Fithian Adams' method, if we apply it, might produce what we could describe as a greater northeast, based upon an alignment on the Isla, River Isla and Spey, River Isla and Tay to Spey boundaries. You see them marked there on the map in red. Or we might go for what we could describe as the lesser northeast, taking perhaps the south-esque to Spey boundary, which you see marked with the blue through up to the red of the Spey. Within the northeast, a division using the D would add further nuance with, if you like, a north-northeast of Aberdeen and Banff, with a south-northeast of Kincardine and Angus, and they have very different urban makeups and rural economies, all of which would add weft and weave of nuance to any understanding of how these regions connected to the wider phenomenon of colonisation and colonialism. Now, given what we do know about how different parts of Scotland accessed early modern empire, what other features of the northeast, however we wish to define it, might we want to bear in mind? On the slide, and I'm not going to go through these in any detail, are some of the basic characteristics of that part of Scotland that may possibly or not be relevant when we consider this question. What's very interesting about the northeast of Scotland is in many ways it's a microcosm of the early modern country in general. Parts of Banff, Aberdeenshire and Angus are in a topographic and linguistic sense highland as much as lowland. Meanwhile, some of the lowland and coastal districts were as populous and as economically important as any other part of pre-1820 Scotland. The pattern of regional metropoles with satellite boroughs, which was evident in both the Clyde Basin and the Firth of Forth economic areas, are actually directly replicated in the northeast, with obviously Aberdeen and Dundee being the key metropoles, but with a host of ancillary towns, Montrose, Arbroath, Peterhead, etc., spanning out in a web of interconnection. The difference being that unlike the Clyde and the Forth, this is covering a much larger geographic space. What about politically? Now, one of the most striking features of the Northeast's histories over the long 18th century is the absence of a major regionally important aristocratic dynasty, like the House of Argyll, which was capable of levering state service into the region and of working actively, as the House of Argyll did, to rehabilitate former Jacobite kindreds after 1746. Given how significant Jacobitism is to the northeast, it's noticeable it doesn't have an Argyll figure rehabilitating kindreds the way Argyll did for whole swathes of Argyllshire and particularly Inverness-shire. Crucial here, in other words, is the absence of something. And what we're faced with is looking at a region which in a sense has the declining power of the House of Gordon acting as a possible political blockage, and say the failure of that house to be replicated or replaced with the Arab East Earl's fief. Now, in this context, borough and merchant families, or the capacity of the two university colleges and wider educational infrastructure to act as pump primes for mobilising networks of professional patronage and service migration, probably assume a greater importance. Then there's the major question of the alignment of the region's external connections. These were mostly, but not entirely, eastern and southern in focus. They move across the North Sea to the Baltic and to Scandinavia and to the German and Low Country littorals, and south down the coasting routes to Leith, Newcastle and London. No meaningful excavation of the North East's colonial connections in this period can afford to ignore these intra-British and intra-European maritime hinterlands. They are going to majorly shape the region's participation in global colonialism. The region's North Sea orientation has conventionally been used to explain its lack of involvement in the Atlantic hemisphere of British imperialism. Now, this picture is being subjected rightly to major revision, and this conference is doubtless going to majorly advance this reappraisal. It's going to offer us, I suspect, major new evidence and lines of analysis for the extent of the area's involvement in colonialism. But whose colonialism? One of the benefits of adopting a North-East perspective is that it underscores how Scots, particularly in the pre-1815 period, did not restrict themselves to participation in Britain's expansion. From its founding in 1730 until at least the 1780s, the Swedish East India Company attracted quite a substantial number of Scots merchants, supercargoes and captains. Now, a confidential list from 1761, which shows 49 major rich returnees coming back from Asia and living in Scotland, shows that 5, that's 10%, were actually former Swedish company men who had all been based out of Gothenburg. All of these were Irvins from Aberdeenshire and Abercrombies from Banffshire. Now, over time, of course, it was Britain's empire that attracted far greater numbers. Realignment into imperial activities was probably an unspectacular process involving individuals and micro networks rather than a major regional-wide economic uplift of the type that happened in the Clyde Basin between 1720 and the Kirk of 1770. As it currently stands, we simply don't know enough of the general pattern of aristocratic, gentry, merchant or artisanal engagement with empire, and so what follows for the rest of this talk should in no way be taken as comprehensive. One way of sketching the possible lineaments of the North-East's colonial connections is to chart the presence of empire in the old statistical account entries relating to this part of Scotland. What you see here is a table which summarises these and provides one indication, and I stress it's one indication, of how the region engaged with British colonialism. Or at the very least, we might say these give us some idea of how empire links were perceived by informed local contemporaries. And what you can see is essentially the number of parishes in each of the counties that I've defined as North-East, and the percentage of entries under Army, Navy, West Indies, Jamaica, East Indies and London, so forth, for each county. And a number of patterns that seems to me emerge fairly obviously and prominently. Army service is noticeable, although I should point out that some of the parish entries, it's not clear if they're talking about local defence forces like fencible regiments or volunteering. So some of these entries under Army are not necessarily denoting imperial connections. The West Indies links, again, are quite significant and very broad-ranging, and the entries cover a number of different contexts. Significantly, the number of percentages you see there do not cover general references to the consumption of sugar. I only listed, in a sense, sugar when it notes a specific trend or fact. A good example being the fact that a minister notes for Dundee that in 1756 the borough imported 62 tonnes of sugar a year. By 1793 it's 583 tonnes. In the context, I was quite surprised at the relatively low profile of Jamaica. I was less surprised at the relatively low profile of the East Indies. The way two ministers in Banffshire summarised the Caribbean link, I think, could stand as the story for almost the whole of the region. The entry for the parish of Grange noted how, quote, many natives of it are in the East and West Indies, end quote. Meanwhile, that of Rathlin noted that the key market for the large annual catch of the parish's small herring was through Greenock to Jamaica and to other West Indian colonies. In an unusually comprehensive survey that underlines the value of the statistical accounts, the Minister of Aberdour up on Aberdeenshire's North Parish noted that between 1774 and 1793, 5 people from that one parish, 2 clerks, 1 surgeon and 2 carpenters, had sojourned to the Caribbean. Now, interestingly, that was against 3, again, similar sort of middling class artisanal migrants that had moved to North America. 27 men had served in the Army and Navy during the recent War of American Independence. Now, set against a population of 1,319 in 1770, the numbers involved in the East Indies, or North America for that matter, might be seen as statistically insignificant. But I think we need to be, here's me running off numbers, but I think we should be careful with numbers. Perhaps the more important point to bear in mind is notice how movement into empire was clearly understood as an entirely natural, almost mundane economic option. It's its actual embeddedness in the local worldview that I think is quite telling here. Now, the major takeaway surely from the table you see here is the prominence of London. The metropole was constantly highlighted as the key market destination for the staples produced by the region, staples which employed tens of thousands of people. Be it fish, coarse linen, wool, thread, sail canvas or quarried stone, London looms large in the story of the North East. Linen, sailcloth and fish would have fed directly into the supply chain of the Port of London's trafficking in enslaved Africans. Once these commodities are factored in, the sociology and the sheer scale of connections to Britain's economies of enslavement becomes substantial. It moves the story well beyond the involvement of gentry or merchants in plantation ownership or of artisans in ancillary sectors of the plantation economy. In the borough of Aberdeen alone, 5 major thread companies employ 2,600 men, women and children in the production of linen thread, which is going directly to London by the early 1790s. Material of this sort is shipped from the northeast ports in vast amounts, and it's connecting northeast men, women and children from the lowest social orders. It's entailing shippers, sailors and skippers. Everybody is directly, in that sense, connected into Britain's slave trafficking sectors. Many of the old statistical account entries mentioning the British capital also draw attention to the Northeast's other great staple export, namely middling social order migrants. If the ministers of places like Grange and Aberdour noted the movement overseas of soldiers, sailors, carpenters and wrights, those moving to London were treated almost as what I would describe as a sort of part of a culture of the celebrity migrant. The 2 main partners of Finn, Ellis and Company, which is this vast transatlantic merchant house, which has got interests in the Caribbean and as far north as Montreal and Quebec in the fur trade. The partners of that house are both from the northeast. One was from Auchterlitz and the other one owned an estate in Forg. The partners of Finn and Ellis & Co. were seen alongside a host of other London-based individuals from the northeast as typical of the connective, productive and virtuous function of migration. It's noticeable how many of these London celebrity migrants, as it were medical men. Dr. Lorimer from Mortlach and Banff, Sir William Duncan from Lundy, or Sir William Fordyce from Aberdeen, who leaves his large medical library to his alma mater, Marischal College. These men are being projected as exemplars of the region's highly productive migration economy. The prominence of the London link is such that any attempt to comprehend the Northeast's involvement in British imperialism will have to reconstruct the region's gentry, mercantile, borough, university and maritime links into the capital. The The example of the part of the empire I'm most familiar with, the East Indies, can demonstrate just how central the British metropolis was beyond its market function for staple exports and as the destination for Northeast professionals. Involvement in the Asia half of the empire required substantial and sustained leverage in the City of London. And viewed from this perspective, the position of the Northeast within the broader Scottish presence inside Britain's empire begins to become telling. Using the company's records, it's possible to recover the origins and career cycles of at least, at a very conservative estimate, 4,013 Scots who served as civil servants, military and merchant marine officers, surgeons, and private merchants and mariners between 1690 and 1813. The 1813 date is chosen because that's the year the corporation loses its monopoly of trade with Asia and the whole nature of the empire changes in some ways. Now, of that number, all but 174 went to Asia after 1750. So the move out to Asia is really jacking up after in the decades following 1750. Set against the large transatlantic migrations, these numbers again may seem trivial, but these are individuals operating at the apex of an organisation which controls one whole hemisphere of Britain's world empire, and by the late 1810s controls the destiny of a minimum of 40 million souls. Compared to other parts of northeast Scotland, compared to other parts of Scotland, the northeast secures a substantial share of these posts. 48 out of the 439 civil servant offices that go to Scots go to the northeast. So in other words, the northeast is gaining a greater ratio of these elite posts and offices than the Borders, than the Lothians, and interestingly, more than West Central Scotland. 280 military officers from Banff, Aberdeen, Kincardine and Angus can be traced to the company's armies between 1750 and 1813. Again, this is a greater ratio amount than the Lothians, the Borders and West Central Scotland. With a minimum of 65 traceable surgeons, the Northeast supplied the East India Company with the greatest share of medical men from any part of Scotland. Scotland is supplying a greater share of medical men than any other part of Britain or Ireland. All this movement into the Army, the Navy, the East and West Indies and London generated connections that reach back into the Northeast. Now, a lot of the conference papers are going to dwell on the themes of returning imperial wealth on landed society, civic and university life, so I'm only going to highlight one or two broad examples of this phenomenon. Again, using the Asia half of the empire, one of the key indicators of this returning phenomenon is, of course, estate purchase. We're seeing in the northeast the same pattern of estate acquisition, which we know happens through the redeployment of imperial wealth in and around Glasgow as the tobacco and sugar lords move into landed property. This map shows that the minimum of 31 estates were purchased by individuals returning from East India Company service between the dates of 1760 and 1820. That's a reasonably significant pattern of estate purchase. It's also a very conservative estimate. Notice it's Angus and Kincardine that tend to do rather better than Banff and Aberdeenshire. The clutch of estates you see in central western Aberdeen is the Forbes of Strathdon and Auchernich purchasing a small collection of estates in that part of the world. A less well appreciated influx of wealth came in the form of those with East India profits lending to existing owners, who then use their landed acreage as collateral. So Asia wealth isn't just purchasing estates, it's being lent to others who have estates. Sayzines demonstrate this happens on a major scale across Scotland, and the northeast is no different. A total of £183,845 is lent out across the northeast between 1781 and 1813 alone. 1 in 4 parish across the whole of the northeast has money from Asia lent upon it. Now, to put that sort of amount into context, that's the equivalent of the entire lending stock of 3 provincial banks. We already know that the empire made its way back into society by any number of different means, no more so than the university sector. By mid-century, Marshall and King's have effortlessly switched their function from Jacobite seminaries to imperial institutes, and they benefit accordingly. Dr. Alexander Moyer from Auchendown, who had made a fortune in St. Croix, left £600 to King's. The example of Elizabeth Farquharson of Jamaica's £600 bequest to poor relief and education in Glenmick, or the major bequest left by the Bombay merchant George Smith to his hometown of Fordyce, shows how imperial and colonial wealth seeped into and down society. Arguably the most spectacular example of the enriching of the North East's civic fabric was the £10,000 donation by John Forbes, whose offices you saw at the beginning, in the 1810s. His money enabled the construction in the late 1810s of a state-of-the-art asylum, which you of course see here and is still there at Cornhill. If the region's well-developed educational framework provided a service gentry or technocratic route into empire, the influence was also becoming full circle as empire materially enhanced and modernised the region's civic provision. This brief survey of the North East's engagement with pre-1815 British colonialism has missed out as much as it has covered. How, for example, did the region's relatively Episcopalian character shape, if at all, the trajectory and cultural tone of involvement in empire? Did the fall of Episcopalianism in 1690 as the state religion result in a diaspora of clergy out into a receptive Anglican empire, following, as it were, in the footsteps of James Blair to Virginia? If there was such a thing as an Aberdeen Enlightenment, the intellectual milieu of Thomas Reid and James Beattie, how did it contribute to key imperial controversies, be these the empire's deep dependency on racialised economics of slavery, or the rejection by American patriots of the sovereignty of Crown and Parliament? Missing too conspicuously from this paper are those on the receiving end of colonialism, the enslaved Africans and their descendants forced to work on the plantations of the likes of Gordon of Knockesbuck, or Margaret Campbell, the mixed-race daughter of an East India Company surgeon and Indonesian woman, who was cruelly rejected by her father's Perthshire family and who died alone in Aberdeen in 1789. Recovering their lived experience requires imaginative, against-the-grain methodologies which enable disparate archived resources to talk to each other in new ways. That's an issue of scale, which again points to the utility of a regional approach.
Hello.
And I'm just about finished.
Okay.
And it's on the positive case for working regionally that I want to finish. In Scottish historical studies, the tendency to see the country's engagement with pre-1815 empire tends to work in bilateral terms, in terms of direct links. Glasgow to the Chesapeake, Skye to the North Carolina frontier. The value of the Northeast example is, it seems to me, that it points to less direct, multilateral connections, with the area experiencing empire almost at one step removed, through commodity export and import, as well as migratory links to London. A striking feature of the Northeast's connection with British imperialism was the use of educational and professional service as a form of social mobility, a sort of service gentry capitalism. Regional society proved adroit at deploying its dense educational infrastructure to maximise the quality of its human capital. This service-led capitalism and colonialism was a manifestation of how the Northeast's civic fabric and London North Sea orientation shaped its trajectory into empire. Involvement occurred through multiple points of interaction rather than one dominant bilateral mode of contact. In a Scottish context at least, this is an underexplored way of thinking about how overseas connections were both truly transformative, yet in some ways surprisingly mundane, in some ways distant and domesticated. As will doubtless become apparent over the course of the conference, scaling down to a regional and local perspective simply means scaling up in new ways. For all these reasons and more, critically reappraising Britain's global colonialism through a regional lens will facilitate nuance and new sophistication, something I'm sure we're about to find out over the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mackie. That was incredible. Thank you for such a kind of broad-ranging and a perfect introduction, I think, for this discussion. So we have roughly 5 minutes for questions. I've opened up the floor. If there's anyone who wants to ask their own questions or make a quick comment, you have the opportunity to do so now. If you don't want to ask the question yourself, you can post it in the chat and I will ask it. We did have a comment from Wendy Sutherland. Do you have a question?
I just have a question about the herring. I'm from Trinidad, and I think that the smoked herring that was so much a part of what we grew up with, and also the cod, the salt cod or saltfish as we call it. Now you're making me curious to know where did this come from, actually.
Yes, Wendy, thank you. I think one of the major ways in which I think we're going to have to recalibrate the nature of Scottish involvement and who in Scottish society is involved is along particularly linen, which I know a colleague of mine in Glasgow, Sally Tuckett, is working on, but also another colleague of mine, Dr. Peggy Bernash, is doing fantastic stuff on sort of food history approaches from the Caribbean perspective. And Scottish fish as a form of sustained high protein foods for enslaved peoples is absolutely central. I think there's a whole fascinating way in which we'll need to think about how fish end up in plantation societies, and equally how do people in those societies think about that food source. How do they conceive of it? How do they integrate it into their own culture? And how is that food source understood back in the small fishing villages of the northeast, or for that matter, Argyllshire? These are really fascinating questions, which point to more than just economic links, but would take us into the field of cultural dynamics, which would be fascinating. But it's a big area that needs opening up majorly. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Andrew Dilly has a question.
Hi, thank you, Desha, and thank you, Mackie. It was fascinating. I can't resist asking you a question, of course. So I just got I think in your discussion of kind of, if you like, the worlds of empire with which Scotland and the Northeast are engaging, you're sort of, I think, kind of bifurcating between a Western Atlantic empire, where you're mentioning a Caribbean a lot, of course, naturally, and an Eastern empire in Asia. And I'm just wondering whether we ought also to break those two units down. And I'm particularly thinking here, and invite you to comment on the strength and importance of, say, the northeast of Scotland's connections with the fur trading world of the Hudson's Bay Company, which again actually would kind of, break down the Atlantic, but also getting into the Hudson's Bay Company involves, again, the kind of patronage networks you're talking about in London. So I'm wondering if you could sketch that a little for us as well.
Yes, surely, Andrew. First, hello, welcome. How are you? Secondly, I think that's a great point, and I think there is no doubt about it that that one of the additional values of our regional approach is that it does tend to suggest new ways in which we can see the traditional silos of the empire itself as perhaps a lot more porous than we think. For example, I mentioned Finn Ellis and Co, the landowners from Auchterless and Forg. They operate in a sense, right up across the Britain's Atlantic Empire on the axis we tend to forget about, which of course is north-south, namely from the Caribbean colonies post-American independence up into the fur trade. They are major investors in the East India Company. They're obviously keeping a weather eye on the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, which, as you say, have major Scottish connections. So in a sense, these type of organisations traverse the sort of conventional boundaries which you quite rightly criticised my paper for consolidating. So lesson learned. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so Carolyn, you also have a question. Carolyn? Okay. Rosie, you had a question. No? Okay. Okay.
My answers must be putting people off, Daisha, I suspect.
Right. Yes. Okay. Well, I guess that's it for now. I'm pretty sure this is going to continue. And as you said in your talk, I think all the points you made, I think, can open up and branch off into what's going to be explored throughout. So no doubt we're going to be coming back to some of the points you made. Thank you, Andrew. Sorry. Thank you, Mackie. Sorry.